Larry? All right, I will call the meeting to order. This is a joint work session for the Oregon City Commission and the Planning Commission, and today is Tuesday, July 7th. Around the table we have
Alan Dunn, Planning Commission.
Tim Powell, Planning Commission.
Doug Neely, City Commission.
Jim Nasita, City Commission.
Daphne West City Commission.
Joao, Planning Commission.
Chris Groner, Planning Commission.
Dan Rutlock, Community Development Director.
Larry Patterson, City Manager.
Rocky Smith, City Commission.
Carter Stein, Planning Commission.
Scott Archer, Community Services Director.
Nancy Ide, City Recorder.
Colin Minor, Oregonian.
Christine.
Paul Lecter, Oregon City.
Great, thank you. This is 100% attendance, so that's good. We have one item on our agenda. As you know, we're all working at various levels on urban and rural reserve. So tonight we get another shot at it as we move closer to the deadline for the Core 4 to make their decision, which actually has been moved to March. So we brought a little bit more time. So, Dan, are you this one? Okay, Dan, draw off.
Okay, the Commission asked for an update on this process. We have two processes that are going on simultaneously. So what I'm going to do is try to go through briefly that process, and then there are a number of materials that I've included, and I'm going to try to go through those briefly. And if you have any questions, just interrupt me. It's just a lot of information. But first I wanted to, again, clarify that these two processes are different. They're interrelated, but they're different, and their timing is a little different. One is that this whole urban-rural reserve question, and that's based on 50-year forecasts of both employment and population housing. And that decision is a cooperative decision between Metro and 3 counties. The other process that's running concurrently is the urban growth boundary expansion process. That's based on 20-year forecasts. And obviously those two are linked. In an ideal world, we have this whole urban-rural reserve question answered before the urban growth expansion question is answered.
Which is by the end of the year next year,
Right.
2010.
2010. Now, the urban reserves question is supposed to, the counties and Metro are supposed to have a decision, I believe it's the end of 2009. So everything goes.
I think you moved it to March.
March of 10.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So even if they move to March of 10, they'll still be ahead of the 20-year urban growth boundary expansion decision. And I think that's probably a good thing. Let's see. It's like, where was I going to go with that?
Two processes.
Yeah, two processes. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, let's go into the urban reserve question. And I've included a summary of the process that Clackamas County put out, because obviously we're involved in that, and Commissioner Neely is on the PAC.
And
for
Daphne
that.
is the
Alternate.
alternate.
And if you look through that summary, you can see they have definitions, again, of the urban growth boundary, the urban and rural reserves. And with that whole reserve discussion, it's important to remember that decision is not mandatory, unlike the UGB decision. This is an optional decision, and it's only going to happen if all 4 parties agree. So this is really an experiment in land use planning. It's something new. The other thing to remember is you don't have to be urban or rural. You can be non-designated. And I imagine we'll probably see a lot of those come out of the process because, as you know, this is pretty political. And I think there are going to be some areas, Stafford's an example, where there's a lot of pressure to make it urban. There's a lot of pressure to keep it rural, and it's adjacent to the existing, metro area boundaries. So, but if an area is undesignated, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not protected. The state back in 1972 mandated EFU zoning, exclusive farm and forestry zoning, which requires large lots, doesn't allow any development. And if you have an area that, let's say, remains undesignated and has that zoning, that's a really solid protection for both ag lands and natural resource lands. So it's important to keep that in mind because people tend to just look at the two, and there's the third part of that.
So this is not a zoning process?
The reserves is not a zoning process. It's a designation process. So if an area, for example, is designated urban, it means that those are the first areas that will be looked at for an urban growth boundary expansion. They won't even look at undesignated areas unless all the urban areas have been used up. So
They have to be fully used.
they have to be used.
Regionally fully used?
Yes,
or-
yeah, the whole metro area. That could potentially be a lot of.
Well,
land.
that's one of the issues that's before us, is how much room do we have in the current UGB? And in Oregon City, we have a lot.
Yeah, well, and we'll get to that a little later. There's quite a bit of land in the whole region for the next 20 years. But when you get beyond that, it's a different picture. But, Doug?
It is contentious though, because the last go around when you had urban growth expansions occurring, this was I guess about 6-7 years ago.
Yeah.
Cornelius requested and had the Metro support of taking some of their expansion to the EFU land. It was taken to Luba, and Luba turned it down, but it still is contentious in where you've got the urban areas smack up against the EFU land.
Right. So let's see a little bit about the county's timeline. And again, this is in this first handout that summarizes Clackamas County. We're really in, you can see on the third page of their handout, they divided their work into 5 phases, and we're really ending the 4th phase and completed the recommended rural reserve areas in the county. And I think it's in July, July 28th. If you go to the end of that handout, you'll see the updated schedule for the county process. On July 28th, they'll begin discussions of the urban reserve areas. And once the PAC is done with those areas, it'll go to the Clackamas County Commissioners for their final decision. You know, when you say, Doug, there's a good chance that the county commission could change the PAC's recommendations in some areas.
Sure. They are only recommendations, and there are informal votes taken on various things. Sometimes they're split right down the middle. So no, it's strictly advisory. Incidentally, the possible rescheduled meeting on the 14th is going to happen. So
Right.
there is a meeting on the 14th, and then 2 weeks later.
And you can see on that schedule on the 23rd of September is the target date to receive those final recommendations, not only from Clackamas County, but the other 3 counties. And I would say, Doug, maybe you can correct me if I'm missing anything, but the last time we met as a group, we put together this map that showed potential areas that we thought the county should look at for urban reserves. And based on some of the results on the rural reserve discussions and the discussions I've had with the staff on the urban reserves, they're tracking fairly close to what we had for a recommendation. The only area that I think will be eliminated from the urban areas based on the PAC discussions are this area along the Clackamas River due to the steep slopes and the floodplain. I think you'll probably see that as rural. And then similarly along the Willamette between Kanema and New Era, that steep area there too. I know we had this as a potential urban reserve, and that was designated rural. At least the PAC designated that rural.
One thing they've also pulled because of natural features or whatever, however they refer to it, is Abernathy Creek and Oak Creek. And that was a staff recommendation.
Right.
To designate those as rural.
Rural.
So, like, how many feet besides those rivers?
Well, it takes in the steep portion of the watershed, I'm sure. I mean, they're looking at the slopes of floodplain and everything when they did it. I don't think they even have that kind of detailed maps on making that decision.
Yeah, I don't think it's been drawn to an
No.
exact line at this point. And, you know, part of the issue here, we were actually talking about this before the meeting, is some of these rural areas, you have to make sure that when you look at designating an area a rural, if it's in between two urban areas, how does that affect the efficient use of existing services? You know, if you're starting to divide contiguous urban areas up with these little strips of rural areas, that has an effect too. It's not very efficient, really, use of existing infrastructure and investment. So that's, you know, it's important to balance all these different factors that are required. So, speaking of factors, your next handout is, after that Clackamas County schedule, are the urban reserve factors. And when the Clackamas County planning staff works with the PAC, they go through, you know, each area they go through this list and provide their best analysis of these different areas. The information really varies. Some of it's pretty thorough, some of it's fairly sketchy. So it's not an exact science, but I think on balance it's working fairly well. But what I like to do is just go through some of those factors. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and interrupt me. But so in all these different factors, they've been rating the areas either low, medium, and high. So it's fairly qualitative analysis. But the first factor is sanitary sewer. You know, that's fairly easy. If you have the right slopes and it flows downhill, it ranks high. If you have pump station, a lot of pump stations, it ranks low. Then the next one is water. Again, there's something that's high would probably be in an existing water district and have some distribution system already in place. If it was low, they probably don't have any investment. I think transportation is a difficult one because they're trying to measure two different things. One is the cost of building a system, and the other is connectivity between existing systems. And in areas that are already built up, it's easy. Areas that are 100% rural, it's kind of hard to measure that. So, for example, in the Beaver Creek area, the connectivity existing isn't the greatest, but when you look at the fact that you have two north-south arterials, you have Beaver Creek Road and 213, and the land's relatively flat, there is an ability to connect some of those up. So those are the kind of things that you look at. And if you look at the Park Place area and areas east of that, you have a lot of steep slopes. The roads are really narrow. Connectivity in a place like that is probably going to be a lot more difficult. And also the costs of putting in a system are going to be hard. So, and again, that's a qualitative evaluation that the county's doing not only around Oregon City, but all over Sandy, Stafford, all those different areas. So it's really a relative measure. The next area has to do with parks. And again, this is difficult because in existing built areas you may have parks, and rural areas you probably don't. Stormwater, public schools. I think we thought the Beaver Creek area came out pretty good because it's close to Clackamas Community College and our high school. Another factor they look at. So all those are part of one factor that they review in the urban reserve discussion. The second factor is called, or asks the question, is there sufficient development capacity to support a healthy economy? And so example of that would be, if you're going to bring an area in as urban, is there enough developable land there that it can be developed at urban densities to help pay for the infrastructure that needs to be built to serve it? So that's part of the question under this, sufficient development capacity. And again, you can see that that's a pretty speculative analysis. Factor 4 has to do with, can an area be developed that's walkable with a well-connected system of streets, bikeways, trails, and public transit? Factor 5 is, can the area be designed to preserve and enhance natural ecological systems? And part of that analysis goes to this map. This was the natural features map. And the Audubon Society has been lobbying really hard that all the counties and all the PACs take a really close look at where the steep slopes are, where the Title 13 resources are, where the forest cover is, in designating urban areas. So it's been I think, a lot of emphasis on that. The next factor 6 is including sufficient land suitable for a range of housing types. And I think, again, that gets back to having enough developable land that you have the ability to put in low, medium, and high-density housing. Factor 7, can the area be developed in a way that preserves important natural landscape features? That gets back to this map again. Factor 8, can the area be designed to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on farm and forest practices? Any adverse impacts on important natural landscape features or natural land including rural reserves. I think, Doug, you alluded to that, is when you have the urban growth boundary right next to rural areas. Is there a natural buffer or a logical end to some of these urban areas where they expand? So they're also looking at that.
You used to call that hard edges, didn't you?
Yeah. So that's those are all the that's what's going to be going on in the next month or two at the counties, going through the factors. And I've attached the map that has Oregon City, and what you see there are these areas U6, 7, 8, and 9. Those are the areas, and how they broke out the areas to consider for urban areas. And I actually like these boundaries pretty well. I think U8 covers all of the Beaver Creek area and all that area between 213 and Beaver Creek Road. U7, in my discussions with the county, I've said that we probably would not want to see that come in because of all the water features and steep slopes and the wetlands, except for those flat areas adjacent to our existing boundaries. And those are some pretty small areas, but they are pretty flat, and you can still get sewer to flow without pump stations. U6 and U9, I think, are really tough areas. The boundaries that they have here match really close with what we sent to them to take a look at. And again, some of those areas, especially on the east, may be really, really tough to serve, and the connectivity will be difficult. But I'm sure those discussions will go on in a little bit more detail with the PAC. Yeah, Doug.
Daphne?
Did I miss
Pull your. Thank you.
Thank you. Did I miss the color coding on the differences between the U6, 7, 8, and 9?
No, that's just so you can see them.
Oh,
Yeah, there's no.
it doesn't mean different things for.
No. Those are just how they're going to discuss the areas.
And tell me, what you said U7 was a lot of slopes that the sewer wouldn't work. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that area drops off from the
That's
plateau as
below
you
the
go south.
bluff there on
Right.
south end or
Right.
central.
So that's sort of a brief summary of what's happening with the rural and urban reserves. The next thing that I handed you are a series of reports. In September of this year, Metro is going to combine these three reports along with some real technical support for the Urban Needs Report, and that's the report that they're going to use to figure out how much land they need to bring in for the urban growth boundary expansion. So that's why there's a lot of discussion and a lot of arguing about the little facts and figures in here. So what I'd like to do is maybe just go through a few highlights. Let's do the employment one first, which I thought was pretty interesting. If you go to page 6, you can see one thing they're trying to do is figure out both the supply and demand for industrial land and non-industrial land. And when Metro talks about non-industrial land, that's a pretty wide category. It could be retail, it could be office. It's a pretty broad category. And then what they did to analyze what they think is a future market for those type of uses, they divided the whole metro area into these different areas. And you can see that Oregon City got lumped in this area called Outer Clackamas County. And it includes Damascus and the whole East Clackamas County. And I think that has some significance in some of the statistics that came out of that, but I'll get into that in a little bit here. If you take a look at Figure 1 on page 7, you can see the shares of 3 different types of uses: manufacturing, non-manufacturing, and government. And the distribution in those areas over that time period, 75 to 2007 to 2030, which is again, a 20-year forecast for that's used in the UGB expansion. And you can see manufacturing dropping significantly, and a lot of that shifting over to non-manufacturing. So that could be service jobs, retail, that kind of thing. And you also see the share of employment in government gradually going down too. Now that's not a total number, these are shares in terms of percent. So that government number is probably going up, but the share of the total is going down. And the share of the total in non-manufacturing is going up significantly. So, and that's what we're seeing, that over the last several decades, the manufacturing jobs have really been reduced. And that has some significance in terms of wages too, and what we collect for taxes. The next thing I want to point out is on page 9, Figure 3. This is pretty scary, I think. It's the 2010 to 2030 industrial demand, which was really surprising to me because Metro was pushing this industrial land requirement really hard a few years ago. If you look at Outer Clackamas, the demand for industrial land is teeny, especially when you compare it to the other areas. Now this is market. They're trying to measure market demand, not capacity. In other words, we have a lot of land that's available but not developed. That shows up in another chart. This is their projection on market demand, and so you can see it's pretty weak. The next is what they forecast on page 10, Figure 4, market demand for non-industrial square footage, and you can see, again, pretty small number for Outer Clackamas.
Can you give us reasons why they think it's that low?
What, excuse me?
Can you give us reasons why they think it's that low here?
2 reasons. One is the whole argument about clusters, industrial clusters, that you need some sort of base to attract other industries. And the other one is that the infrastructure. See, we're lumped with Damascus and East County where they don't have the infrastructure yet. And they're theorizing that if you're a business, you're not going to even bother looking out there. You'll look to a site that already has the infrastructure, shovel ready.
And I just think of Oregon City. I mean, we do have an effective expressway going all the way to 205, for example. And yes, there are problems on it. There are problems on almost any major highway system that you could think of in the whole region.
Well, I think this understates Oregon City's potential because we're lumped with East County.
Yeah.
And I think that's unfortunate in a way.
Yeah, and Metro Council, I hear all the time. I mean, one of the, as we argue about whether the numbers are correct or not, because these numbers are a range. For instance, like what is the infill rate? What's going to be? And that's important to know. But they also, as we evaluate the performance of the last UGB move, they're concerned that a lot of us turn industrial land into commercial land. And they talk about Beaver Creek all the time. You're not living up to the potential that you were supposed to. You let it slip into commercial land, which isn't of high value. I don't think we're really part of the problem. But
No, it's pretty
it's pretty
insignificant.
insignificant. But we hear that. So that's, if you zone it, can you keep it as industrial as well?
The other part of the whole forecast for employment is this refill capacity. And there's been a lot of discussion on this, both for employment and residential. So refill means how much of new development is going to go to a site that already has a development in there. So it might change use, like Mayor Norris was mentioning. It might be an empty building that they refurbish. So it's everything other than a green field open site with nothing on it. And refill usually takes a little more money to build. So that's why a lot of folks on the development side of things are criticizing this refill rate. Metro's thinking 24% of all industrial development is going to be this refill. It's too high. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And the other discussion item is later on we'll see that Metro doesn't forecast really a need for a lot of new industrial land, but the folks in the business are saying you need a lot of these large parcels in industrial to attract the bigger businesses. So that's an argument that's going on right now. Page 13. So now this is the other part of the question here is the capacity. So how much land is out there that's zoned for industrial? And if you look at Outer Clackamas, I mean, we're the highest. So they're saying we have the lowest demand and the highest out there to use. So there's a little disconnect there. And it's pretty much the same for non-industrial capacity. Outer Clackamas, again, is pretty high. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about for the employment. Let's go to the residential. Yeah.
Dan, given all you've said, I'm surprised looking at the map on page 11. It shows 224 and the really heavy intensity of industrial development along 224.
Right.
And what does that do statistically to our outer area?
Well, that's reflected in that last chart we talked about it, where Outer Clackamas had so much capacity, not market demand, but the land's out there, and so that's these little red dots are showing parcels that are zoned for industrial and available. Right. So on your residential report, it's dated March 09. This is pretty interesting. On page 6, you can see at the bottom it says new dwelling unit demand range within the Portland metro area. So there's a fairly you can see they have two forecasts. One low, one assumes a fairly low population growth, one relatively high. And so that corresponds into dwelling units. Again, this is a 20-year time frame. So on the low end, 224,000 new dwelling units and 201,500 on the high end. So on the next page, it sort of explains why these two numbers are different, why there's a low and why there's a high. If you look to the low on the key assumptions, the second one down is this refill rate again. You can see that 27%, so that means you have maybe an old apartment or an old house or something, and it's destroyed and built at a higher density. Or you have a parcel that has a single-family house and it's subdivided into 4 smaller lots. And if you have enough of those, it can accommodate quite a bit of growth. So this refill rate at 27% is actually the low. And if you look at the high supply, they have a refill rate of 40%. So they're saying 40% of all new units are going to go in existing lots that are split into smaller lots and those kind of things.
And there will be a time when we have to make a choice. We have to put a number on that continuum from 27% to 40% and decide. So the arguments are, do we aim low and squeeze, or do we aim high and have vacant land before we need to, which just sits there and doesn't move like is happening now, because there is really very little performance in the last urban growth boundary expansion.
Right.
Doug?
I assume that one of the reasons they're pushing actually for a higher refill rate is because infill and refill is not has not probably occurred at a rate that they were hoping for, and if you expand, then there's little incentive for people that are developing those sites
Right.
to actually infill or refill.
Exactly.
Whereas you restrict the opportunities, there's a greater incentive to do it.
Right. And it is really a policy, a good example of how a policy choice can affect whether you're going to expand or not. And actually, in Portland, we've been pretty good at refill. We've had a relatively high refill rate, and we haven't had to expand as much as most cities have.
Dan?
Yeah.
So this is based on the 20-year current urban growth boundary, correct?
Right.
This number is
Well, it's the forecast,
forecast.
population forecast.
Okay, thank you.
The other issue under high supply, the last one listed, says additional units from urban renewal and/or incentives. There's been a lot of discussion on that issue. You know, the theory is if you have urban renewal, you can help subsidize housing, and a lot of the housing will be at higher densities, more refill, more infill, less expansion. Another policy choice. And so there have been a lot of arguments on what those numbers should really be. And again, the development industry, the Homeowners Association, has been criticizing Metro for having those numbers too high. They don't know if urban renewal is actually that effective in bringing in a ton of new units. I
They
mean,
haven't seen most of the renewal districts give incentives for housing and for density.
That's right.
They do it for employment.
So that's not a valid argument.
That seems to be. I'm sorry, who's was Daphne?
You meant the Home Builders Association, right, Dan?
Yeah,
And Realtor.
Yeah.
I did.
Lost what I was gonna say.
Yeah, they're the most vocal ones at the table.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. It must be hard for them to make a case with the last expansion not filled around the whole metro area in some ways. I mean, it hasn't been, right?
Well,
A lot of the
but part
last
of-
20, the last
part of-
2GB hasn't been built out.
Part of that, though, is, voter annexation. That's
Just in our area.
in our area, yeah. And then in Damascus, just the inability to finance infrastructure.
And plus some of the voter-approved initiatives that they have there too,
Mm-hmm.
as well. So they're, yeah, so we've, I think, together around the tables, we are identifying the factors that cause the lack of performance, and then ticking off how can we remove the barriers. And then I think what you didn't mention, but I think these are absolutely key. Where is it? The factors that make a successful region. That those are on every metro list, and I really like them. Where are they? I saw them in the first few pages of the last report.
Oh, in
The
the,
characteristics of a successful region: vibrant communities where you can walk for pleasure and meet your needs.
Which
Sustained
book are you in?
Economic development. The first one, page 2.
The
I think they're in
employment
all of them, but
one.
Page 2. And then safe and reliable transportation choices that enhance your quality of life. A leader in minimizing global warming. Current and future generations can enjoy all the clean environment. And then last one is equity. The benefits and burdens of growth and change are distributed equitably, which is a big stumbling block here with all industrial jobs going out to Hillsborough, that huge area there. And then, as you just saw, we have capacity here, but we're unable to,
Yes.
get clusters to take root. Although that North Clackamas area that you were mentioning is beginning to move a little bit, but it isn't moved out towards Damascus. It's just clustering kind of in the area that's already easily accessible. Sorry. Go ahead.
That's a good point. On page 8, back to this household forecast, you can see that colored graph. The dark lines, those are the housing units, the high end and then the low end projection and housing units. That's why they're different, the dark lines. And then the shaded areas, that's the existing capacity. And if the area is solid, that means that's based on current policy. In other words, things that are already in existence. And the area with the little dotted areas, those are future policy choices. So you can see that, for example, if you go talk about the second one down, it says urban renewal investments. Below that, it says refill, higher refill rate. So what that means is that if you make the policy choice to aggressively use urban renewal to get more housing units, if you create policies to increase infill and redevelopment, then you look at this chart and your capacity of land goes way, way up. But what's interesting about this is that if you do make those policy choices, you have more land than you need in the forecast, in the 20-year forecast, back to those black lines, which I think is pretty interesting. So if Metro were to decide, yeah, let's make these decisions about investing in housing through urban renewal, let's encourage refill and use of vacant land, then there's really no reason to expand the boundary in 20 years. Now, even if you look at the black line, which is the lower end forecast, that line pretty much stays below what we have today up until a little past 2020. So that means that even if we assume low growth and policies as they are today, we shouldn't have to expand the urban growth boundary until sometime after 2020.
And that's kind of where we're headed, I think. The leaders around the region, except for the home builders and realtor groups, are really seeing that the capacity, they're arguing about the numbers, but they really have capacity where we are. So that's not as gray as it is beyond 2020.
And the other important thing to remember about this is that if you did an analysis, in the olden days, they used to do this thing called zone capacity. So you'd look at each city's zoning, and you'd assume that it built out to the maximum the zoning allows. They used to do that for employment, too. That never happens. So, hardly ever. So when now when we do these forecasts, they assume a lot of market factors. So, if it's zoned for 20 units an acre, they'll look at the market and the area, and they'll make a judgment. They won't say it's automatically going to be 20. And it's just like our regional center. We have now, in 2004 we changed our zoning, and you can have 5-story. You could have 5-story retail on everything in our regional center. But is there a market for it? Probably not. At least not right now. Yeah. So that's a change, I think, from the past. So let's see. Guess that's all I wanted to talk about that. And then the last piece of this, it's called preliminary housing needs analysis. I think what I thought was really interesting was on page 6. And I think this is something that we haven't thought about a lot in the past, even in the planning world, but it's really important. When you talk about affordability and affordable housing, you don't just look at housing, you look at the cost of transportation. And what's amazing is you can look at, for instance, if you look at Phoenix, that's probably about 3/5 of, wait a second. Well, let's just say almost half the money that they spend on housing is spent also on transportation. And when you add both of those together, it's 42% of the average income for that area. So the point is when you look at affordability, now you have to look at housing costs, but also transportation costs. And Phoenix and Portland, for example, if you compare those two, the total cost is the same, but you can see that little green bar is higher for Phoenix. That's a transportation. So while housing is more expensive in Portland than Phoenix, it costs less to get around. So that's something I think we have to factor in. And I think the other important part of that is when we look at our urban and rural reserves, going back to that discussion, is we want to make sure that when we designate urban areas that they're efficient. It's easy to get around. You have the connectivity, you have the proximity to places to work, and that was the principles that we used in that whole Beaver Creek concept plan, was to have employment and close to schools and existing infrastructure. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. This is a lot of background statistics that talks about affordable housing in a lot of the different cities. You can go to page 13 and table 2. You can see they've listed all the cities in Portland. The last column lists the percent of cost burden households. You'll see Oregon City at 22%. That's pretty close to the region's average, which is 23%. And then you look at a place like West Lynn at 4%. I think we all, kind of recognize that when you compare incomes to the cost of housing, it's a lot different. As an area like Southeast Portland, 33%, that's a pretty high percent. So that's, I think, some interesting information to keep in mind when we talk about housing developments and those kind of things.
I think we should keep in mind, as I've studied this, if you look, there's only one other, I guess you want to call it a suburban city, outlying city, that has as many cost burden households as we do, and that's Forest Grove.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of them are have a whole different mix, including West Lynn at 6%. That's the one you mentioned, isn't it?
Yeah.
Damascus at 4%, but that's probably because they're not very developed.
But even Tualatin, 17.
Yeah, right. No, they're all.
Sherwood, 15.
Except when you get into Portland, of course, there's areas of Portland that meet us. But I think that's an interesting factor and something to think about, I think, for the future as well. And when I'm hearing also that the term affordable housing is kind of being replaced by cost burden household.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a new replacement because it's a better descriptive than what is affordable. It might be affordable when you buy it, but it might not be for the next generation. So this is easier to.
So that's really all I wanted to cover in terms of information. And at this point, if you have questions or if there's any more information I can get for another sort of update, I'd like to know that.
I just would like to point out maybe one more thing for your pleasure and enjoyment at home. On page 18 of the first book, on the one on employment, I think that those policy choices on those last two, or that page 18 and 19, on the first book on employment executive summary, page 18 and 19 are the policy choices, and I think those are just interesting thought. I don't know if you discuss them, you may wish to, but those are kind of what we're wrestling with around the regional table. And I think in some level we wrestle with those at our local level as well. I'd just like to say one more thing. I was sitting out there looking in when the urban growth boundary was expanded the first time, and at that point it seemed to me, and I think it was very true, local aspirations, local decisions were not taken into consideration at all. The level was the urban growth boundaries expansion. I don't know whether Dan would really say that, but it would look like from the outside. They were made pretty much top-down. Metro decided it should be here, here, and here, and we would all scream and yell. And I think there's been a true policy shift into looking at what's really here on the ground and what our local aspirations are, what kind of community do we want to be, and what quality of life, what are the quality of life decisions that we're making. And
Yeah,
it's a big shift.
Yeah, the discussions that preceded the 2004 decision were really technical.
Right.
Really looking at the numbers. And Metro staff worked with all the different city staff and said, how do these numbers look? And they'd say, yeah, they look fine, or they'd give them changes. And then that sort of drove the whole decision. And now it's, as you say, policy-driven. And Metro's tried really hard to say, let's not start arguing about numbers. Let's talk about what we want the cities to look like. What are the important policy decisions? And then we'll work the numbers from there. So that's a change.
Doug.
Well, I'm glad for your last statement. Actually, one of the reasons the study session was called was a concern of mine that I brought up. The maps we've been working on rural reserves are different than the maps you see in here. These are urban reserve map discussions. First thing I wanted to say, we've gone through the process of, on this policy advisory committee to the Board of County Commissioners, we've gone through this process of looking at rural reserves. Now, these are still the study area pieces. Just because we've identified something as a rural reserve, say in the Policy Advisory Committee, doesn't mean that we don't come back to it and look at it in the urban reserve context. I want to mention that. But the area that we're calling Beaver Creek was actually segmented into 3 different areas. These segments, I think, were based on identifications in terms of agricultural use primarily. The segment that I think we usually think of is Beaver Creek, go down Beaver Creek Road, and then you make this 90-degree turn and so forth. We have earmarked as Section F. The recommendations in terms of rural reserve designation only apply to the natural features. That does not mean it's necessarily going to be any large portion comes in at this stage of the game as a urban reserve recommendation. But it is a conflicted area, and one of those areas that are probably going to be looked at seriously from an urban reserve context. And local aspirations, I think, are extremely important. They're one of the things that are driving the discussions in the Stafford Triangle. Lake Oswego has no interest in serving that area. West Lynn doesn't have any interest in serving that area. The only urban area that's expressed interest has been Tualatin, and it relative in terms of perimeter of the area, Tualatin's got the least perimeter there. And I wanted to bring this up, and particularly in terms of quality of life and local aspirations. Beaver Creek has a sense of place that is very different than Oregon City's. And even if it becomes an urban reserve, I would hope that our aspiration does not include actually that being Oregon City. I think if it's going to be an urban area, then they ought to take control over their own destiny. And it's one of the reasons that I brought this up, and then the study session was recommended to show where we are in the process. At the end of the discussion that I'm involved in, I would like to actually have some support of making this statement to the group should the Beaver Creek area, that Section F, be identified as an urban reserve, that it need not necessarily be, and perhaps is not in its best interest to be part of Oregon City, that it forms its own basic community. It sets up its own zoning. There are a lot of people there that are interested in agricultural production, although we have what we call urban farms here. They're very limited in terms of what they can be. That it sets its own destiny. And I simply wanted to bring that forward in this particular discussion here. And I oftentimes go back to the point, we've had some success and various things have been put out there in terms of the library district, in terms of annexation to Clackamas Fire District 1 and so forth. They've been very successful at the electorate. But we've had various money issues that have been put before the citizens of Oregon City that failed. And if you take a look at the precinct votes, oftentimes the precincts that are in the over part of Oregon City are the precincts that have supported those money issues. It's when you go down to the south end area and over in the Glen Oak area, that's where you see a lot of those that are failing. And I think it has a lot to do with the sense of place that our newer areas don't simply share with the older areas. And I think that's something that we have to look at in terms of our local aspirations.
Comments on that? You know, my interest also is that I don't know that it necessarily has to be part of Oregon City at all. The Beaver Creek area is a little bit more urbanizing. There's certainly a little sense of community there. But it certainly is a wonderful enhancement to have that in concert with our Beaver Creek concept plan, the values of our Beaver Creek concept plan, to have an area that needs services, to find them in our concept plan area. So I think it makes sense for, I don't know whatever the Beaver Creek people would like. Certainly that's the easiest area for us to add some services and housing to. But I think we need to talk about what the buffer is between Beaver Creek and what their aspirations are too. I think it'll be an interesting discussion.
And I don't think, I don't think a comment like that would hurt in as much as it would help some of the political divides that are out there. If, in the end of the day, that what we want is to take a real look at what's around us to get past that, to make a statement like that, in my opinion. Well, one, I agree. I mean, it's something that has to be yet decided, and they get to have a big part in that. But two, if that's what it takes to sort of get that area studied, I'm all for it.
Well, I was listening to you, Doug, respectfully, and I kind of like how you're framing it as buffer zones. Because, in my crystal ball, I can't see if Beaver Creek is going to become their own city, or if they're going to be part of Oregon City, or if there will be a buffer zone. So I'm willing to look at, how we can, how they can keep identifying and remaining to be their own place within this context. But I don't think that I'm in a position to lock up future commissions, whoever that may be, lock up, what they should be doing. I think we'll let them decide what they need to do. But in our time, I respectfully like the buffer. And
Well, my comment is this: if the current elected body doesn't come up with its local aspirations, who does?
well, we can put it in the.
You can't put it off in the future.
No, we can put it in our aspirations, but whether they remain to, if it indeed happens where further development goes on, we can't, we're hoping that it does, or we're setting the stage that it could occur. That's a better way of saying it. But who knows whether Beaver Creek's going to do it, or Oregon City, or nobody. So.
But those are decisions that are actually made. I mean, the reason Damascus came into being was because Metro essentially created it, but the fear was it was going to be swallowed by Happy Valley, it was going to be swallowed by Gresham, and that sense of Damascus would have been lost in the process. I mean, that was part of the whole process. A city does not have to be something that is 50,000 or 100,000.
Right.
A city can be 12 or 15,000. I mean, the size doesn't regulate how big a city is. I don't know how many people are in Johnson City, but there aren't that many.
Well, I think we're just putting it that it's open and it remains to be studied, or it could be studied. Instead of saying it is going to be that way, we're open to it. The growth.
Anybody else? Kim?
I do want to say one thing. With all this data, it's what I'd like to see as we progress to make intelligent decisions. I mean, it's all nice, we see these things, but none of these things really are coordinated in my mind. I see housing, I see employment, but I don't see them tied together. And I'd really like to be able to sit down sometime at our next meeting or whenever we get our next update and see if we can compare these things together. Because like you said, I mean, it's got to be an equity issue. And to Doug's point, Beaver Creek, regardless of what happens, it's got to be an equity issue. I mean, Oregon City is certainly not going to carry the tab so that Beaver Creek can access all of our resources and we get nothing in return. On the other hand, if Beaver Creek wants to provide their own resources and pay for utilizing our services, I think that's fine. I mean, we're having that issue right now with sewer in Milwaukee. I mean, you read about it every day. That's part of the planning process, and I think it's important that we talk about it now. And I don't necessarily think we have to come up with a decision as to what's going to happen with Beaver Creek, but I do think we need to talk about it, and I think it needs to be clear that it's an equity thing. I mean, no citizen wants to pay more than their share, and you hear it over and over again, and that's probably half the reasons our finance programs don't go through, because people feel like they're paying more than their share, whether it's library or fire or anything else. But I guess my point is, I'd like to be able to look at these things and compare them apples to apples. And if we have the most amount of space in development for housing, then we need to tie that housing into employment, because obviously housing costs more than employment, and we take the bigger hit as Oregon City. We've seen that over the past few years. So it'd be nice to be able to tie those together and say, if we're going to provide 40% of the housing for this area, we should be able to get through policy procedures with the county and and Metro and the state, be able to get that employment investment to be able to develop that, so that we can pay for that. And I just like to have that discussion as well.
One of the, we got some initial maps that we're presented with in terms of these rural reserve things that do show some outlines of urban reserves, and the one that we have, not the one that the city developed, the one the county developed, really shows an urban reserve extending down to 13. That to me, in terms of employment area, makes a great deal of sense, because I say 213 serves as an expressway and it'd be a logical place. Both, we are getting people coming from the Molalla area. I think they're looking to see their industrial expansion come somewhat north of them, and makes sense that perhaps ours comes somewhat south as well. So I think that's something that has to be in the picture.
I'm wondering, Dan, you actually did provide us with the estimates of our future employment and our infill, refill.
Yeah, at the last session, I handed out a report that had the population and employment projections.
I'm wondering if the next time we meet, which might be in a couple of months, actually, or even sooner, because we are in the process of gathering the data and trying to get us to decisions, that you have that data for Oregon City specifically, where employment areas are projected to be in, or thinking about housing densities again.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll take a look. I don't know if they break it down any smaller than the city limits, but I'll take a.
I'm wondering if you can use some of these projections to overlay that to make give us any better advice.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing is in I think it's September of this year, all of these reports are going to be put into one report and consolidated, sort of what you were talking about, Tim.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot easier for a layperson such as myself to be able to look at those and make some sense of it. There's a lot of data that we read through and see
You're getting
through.
this fresh off the press. So.
Yeah, and it's trying to make well, and it was good. It was nice. I enjoyed reading it, but they didn't tie together in my mind, and so I was having a difficult time. And I was writing them on my notes and trying to figure out how, if that's the case, how's this the case? And you made a good point. We have the most land, but we have the least amount of potential from their perspective. That makes no sense. I just want to be able to tie it together.
Yeah, and I think that helps us who are sitting at the decision-making tables, too, to understand how all the linkages come together. With, again, the overlay of what makes a successful region and what makes a successful city. I think those are really important this time around.
The next step would be the policy. The policies, and I know your comment, Mayor, about reading those sections about the policy and thinking about those. I mean, I did read through them, and I did think about a lot of that. And a lot of those are really strategic questions that we have to answer. But part of that is, again, they don't tie in with what we're talking about in some cases. And so it'd be interesting to be able to say, if Oregon City takes 40%, we'll use a number, and if Beaver Creek does this, and if, how is the city and the county and Metro and the state, how are we going to tie in our policies so that we can make this happen and really make it happen, as opposed to just talk about it? We've talked about it for a long time, and Oregon City's trying to do it through code changes and things like that. But it's difficult when you've got outlying areas like Clackamas County that doesn't have the same type of codes. That's where we get in these battles with urban and rural. And it'd be interesting to be able to have that discussion, too.
And just one last little thing that I keep bringing up, and I'm going to bring it up at all the tables I sit on, or just a couple. What we're doing in some of the discussions is that those who wish to have land put into rural reserves are doing it because of protection of natural resources, which is for me, it is one of the factors, as you see. But I'm wondering if there's another way to preserve natural resources rather than necessarily doing that. I'm not necessarily certain. I haven't looked at that, so I don't know if that's a bad thing. But it does appear that many people are fearful that we're going to lose natural resources by if lands are designated as rural reserves. I think I was more concerned about losing ag land and losing forest land. But now we have this kind of third factor that seems to be really important. Doug?
Well, I want to bring it up from a taxpayer's position of a person that actually has their land in a natural resource area. And say they've got 40 acres in it. And then it gets swallowed up by urban area, and it's paying city taxes on that land area,
That they
which
can't
they're not
develop.
going to be able to use. So I think from a very practical standpoint, there's a reason for looking at it that way.
Yeah.
And you oftentimes have, frankly, you have urban codes will come in terms of tree ordinances and so forth that will prevent the economic use of that piece of land. That land may have been used for intended timber purposes, and it gets absorbed into a city. You talk about we have voter-approved annexations, but they don't all have that. And then the person's lost an economic base that they originally had in that piece of land. So I don't know if we want to saddle somebody with the tax cost of preserving a natural area when they don't perceive any benefit from that effort. And that may be one reason for doing it.
It's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting discussion. It's new to me, so I kind of wanted to bring that up. And I think that it will filter up to all the other discussions as well to see how do we best wish to protect our natural resource from enforcement.
And which way is the best way to protect?
Lots more discussion. Thanks, Dan. I would appreciate that roundup. And to the Planning Commission, thank you for being here. But I also want to thank you so much for the important piece of work that you've been doing for the last couple of years on the code amendments. We passed that at the last meeting, in case you didn't know. And we figured that there were 13. We've had 13 public exposures, ability for feedback and change, and there have been many of them. And I think this is very substantial work. I hope you're very proud of it, because I think we just talked about quality of life, and this will truly dictate the quality of life that we're moving forward. It's direction for staff, it's direction for citizens and new developments and protection of parks, etc. So again, thank you. I'm really proud of the work you did and the work we all did together by approving it. So thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
I'd echo that, in fact, and kudos to staff for guiding us through that
Definitely.
process. They did
For sure.
Really, really hard work and a really good job. So thanks to staff.
Okay, on that love fest, we are adjourned.
Keep it, yeah.